Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sheehan Scarborough, and I serve as the Director of BGLTQ Student Life in the Dean of Students Office at Harvard College. This is part 2 of Secret Court 100, Harvard's Queer Century, 2 inaugural events to mark the centennial of the Secret Court of 1920. Yesterday's event, Living Histories, featured Harvard faculty and alumni discussing the importance and significance of the Secret Court. Today, I'm here with 6 current undergraduate and graduate student leaders from across the university for a community conversation on the living legacy of the Secret Court and the state of LGBTQ life at Harvard in 2020. These 2 events are just the first in a series that will take place over the next year, first virtually, but hopefully, eventually, in person when we're back on campus. Before we start, a few notes. This event is being recorded with the goal of having it as an archival document of this moment. We'll be making the video available on YouTube for folks who couldn't be here today to see it. So for today's conversation, you'll only see the 6 panelists and myself, the moderator, but we encourage you to submit questions. And there are a few ways for you to do that. You can submit them through the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. And when you do that, please identify whether the question should go to a specific panelist or to the panel broadly. Or if you'd like to ask your question yourself, and we'd love to hear your voice, you can raise your hand during the Q&A using the Zoom function, and I'll call on you. It's also important to note that due to the nature of this secret court, we'll necessarily be discussing homophobia and its devastating impact on the lives and well-being of the students involved, including suicide. As I mentioned before, we will be recording and publishing this conversation, so please take good care. And if there's a moment where you feel the need to step away from the conversation, know that it will be available for you to watch at a later date. And lastly, we'd love to hear your feedback about this event and your interest in joining the effort to commemorate and to reckon with this important part of Harvard's history. And so with that, I'd like to give our 6 panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. And why don't we start with our undergraduates? Alden, how about you?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Alden Fossett. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, which is where I'm zooming in from. I'm a rising senior at the college, and I am just finishing my first year as a programming intern at the BGLTQ office. I've also done quite a bit of work around queer spirituality, and fighting for and advocating for spaces for queer people of faith on campus.
And Natalie.
Hi all, my name is Natalie Gale. I'm also a rising senior at the college, originally from just outside of Portland, Maine, which is where I am now as well. I was a programming intern at the Office of BGLTQ Student Life for 2 years. And in 2019, I was also the director of the college's largest peer counseling group, Room 13. And related to that, was very involved in kind of mental health advocacy for undergrad queer students and otherwise.
Russell.
Hi everyone, my name is Russell. I'm from San Diego and I'm a soon-to-be graduate of the college next week on Zoom. And I have been helping to lead the effort of the centennial with Kamille, whom you'll meet shortly, and Tim McCarthy, whom you may have met yesterday if you were logging on. So it's an honor to be here and I'm really excited to hear from all of you today.
And now our graduate students, Kimm.
Hi everyone, my name is Kimm Topping. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I grew up here in Massachusetts and I'm getting ready to graduate with my master's in education from HGSE. At school, I've been working as an equity and inclusion fellow and also a part of the leadership team for Queer Ed. And outside of Harvard, my work is really focused on supporting LGBTQ+ young people through professional development with teachers and also leadership series for young people themselves, and I'm a co-chair of the Cambridge LGBTQ+ Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimm. And Diego.
Hi everybody, my name is Diego Garcia Blum. I am an MPP at the Kennedy School, MPP 1. I'm originally from Miami, Florida, but I'm an immigrant from Colombia. The Kennedy School has served as the VP of Diversity and as a CPL Fellow. I'm the incoming chair of the LGBTQ caucus at the Kennedy School, and I'm also one of the co-chairs for the LGBTQ plus leadership conference. And I come to the Kennedy School after a long time of activism in the LGBTQ space. I served as a community organizer for the Human Rights Campaign for about 6 years in the Washington, D.C. area. I now serve on the National Board of Governors for the Human Rights Campaign. And my current work is focused on the international crisis abroad of LGBTQ people in the worst places as a Harvard Presidential Service Fellow.
Thank you, Diego. And Kamille.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kamille Washington, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a proud Memphian, so Memphis is the home of both Elvis Presley and Academy Award winners 3 6 Mafia. I graduated from Harvard College in 2010 with a degree in the comparative study of religion, and I'm currently a student in the mid-career MPA program at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm also a former president of the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus, which is Harvard's LGBTQ plus alumni group. I am a bi woman, and I live with my partner Paige and our Frenchie Gunther in Cambridge.
Thank you so much, Kamille. And before we get to our first question, I know that some of you probably weren't able to join us yesterday for our first conversation. So we thought we'd share with you a brief history of the Secret Court. The Secret Court was an ad hoc committee that President Abbott Lawrence Lowell convened to investigate unnatural acts, homosexual activity at the university back in 1920. And this was outside of the normal ad board processes. Dean of the college, Chester Greenough, chaired the court along with several members of the faculty. And this Secret Court first convened in May of 1920. Exactly 100 years ago next week. The 5 men on this court conducted what amounted to a months-long witch hunt where they investigated 30 or so students and some teaching staff and came to the conclusion that 10 should face discipline, resulting in the expulsion or removal of 8 students, 1 recent graduate and an assistant professor. Only 2 of the expelled students were ever readmitted to Harvard to receive their degree. 2 of those students, Cyril Wilcox and Eugene Cummings, died by suicide related to this court. Until 2002, this was literally all secret. It was in a secret archive. Until Amit Pali, a Crimson reporter at the time, class of 2004, found these documents and wrote the Crimson article that gave us the history we now know. So in 2002, Harvard, for the first time in almost 80 years, had to reckon with this important part of our history. Interestingly enough, Amit Pali is currently the CEO of the Trevor Project, the country's leading organization providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to LGBTQ youth. And so with all of this, I want to begin with what I think is the first obvious question. What was your response to this information when you first learned about the Secret Court? It was something that when I share this with colleagues or friends or others who are interested in Harvard and want to know what LGBTQ life is like here, they're often surprised and some even angry that they're finding out so late about this part of our history. So I'm curious to hear from some of you what your responses were. Kimm, I wonder if you could start off.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think it was a mix of emotions. I was obviously upset and angry that this had happened to the people who were impacted and wondered what we could do to see some justice for this. And then at the same time, I don't think that I felt surprised by the fact that this happened, because Harvard is an institution that holds a lot of power within our society, and in many instances has replicated the oppression that we see from the government and society at a larger scale. And so when I found out about this, I was actually also researching the Lavender Scare, which happened in the 1950s, where President Dwight Eisenhower had signed an executive order to eliminate all employees who were suspicious of homosexual activity from their government jobs. And this continued into the 1990s and wasn't apologized for until 2015. And so I think there are some really important comparisons for us to draw between the government and Harvard's history. And it's really just a note for us to challenge Harvard and to question Harvard on its history, and to acknowledge that and find justice for the people who are harmed.
Natalie, what about you?
I think similarly for me, it was very much an experience of kind of at first surprise, but didn't last very long, I would say. It felt more like kind of a proper and long-awaited recognition of the context that I was operating in. So I was a sophomore when I first learned about the secret courts. At that point, I had been really involved in advocacy on campus for over a year. And I actually learned because I was a peer advising fellow in the first year dorm, Greenough Hall, which is named for the former president and also dean of Dunster House, who headed this commission, this secret court process, and oversaw all of this. And I was working in this incredible residential community. I was advising a number of first years who identified as queer and wanted to get involved in the queer community. And someone, I think perhaps my proctor, who was also queer and an active member of the community on campus, made a comment about how ironic it was that we were in this dorm. And I didn't really understand. And then when this was explained to me, it kind of felt like things were falling into place. And I had kind of more of an understanding of this institution on a concrete scale, because I think I had that abstract understanding of what Kimm was mentioning, and of kind of the extent to which societal structures of oppression are very much replicated and ingrained at Harvard. But I think that there is often a hesitance to cite specific events or instances where that has been the case in the past. I think that Harvard doesn't want to talk about it, and it's not exactly casual conversation on campus. So I think for me, it felt as though things were falling into place.
You know, it's interesting to hear you say that, in part because, you know, this isn't casual conversation, but it's such an important part of Harvard's history, and one that, you know, this was a secret court. It was hidden away for many, many decades with intention, you know, an imposition of secrecy. And I wonder, you know, when we're thinking about what this means for all of us a century later, what would you say is, in part, I want to say, the legacy of the secret court? You know, why does this history still matter a century later, and what does honoring this history look like? Russell, I wonder if you have anything to say about that as someone who's behind the organizing, putting all of this together.
Definitely. I think I had a really similar initial response, which is you learn not to be surprised by things like this, but it does continue to beg the question of what should be done. And looking at the Harvard Slavery Project, for example, I think that step one is knowing these histories and being able to acknowledge Harvard's role in them, and also ensuring that people on campus know these histories. I was surprised to have learned it, to have approached Professor Tim McCarthy, whom, as I said, we've been working with, and to really realize that people didn't know it. And I think step one is making sure that there's an education, an acknowledgement, a recognition, and memorialization. But moving beyond that, I think what I really was stricken by is the fact that I had a history, and that this community has a history. Because in our textbooks and the way we learn about Harvard, it's completely erased. And a big part of this is the question of the closet and people whose identities, for different reasons, were hidden away as these students were in many of the cases we look at with this history. But also then realizing that we've always been here, and that this community has gathered despite circumstances. And I think it really led me to just take a new look at the history of this institution and realize that BGLTQ history, A, exists, and B, that it's part of Harvard's history, it's part of Boston's history, and it's part of our national history too. So it became a big question of where we begin to locate this history and our legacy. And I think that that profoundly shapes the way that I consider my own identity and the way that we may begin to reconsider how we gather on campus.
And I think for the question in terms of 100 years later, how does this still matter to us? I think we're finally starting to understand how, because of things like this, homosexual people and LGBTQ people were completely misunderstood. So this was brought about because one of the LGBTQ students at Harvard committed suicide, and then they put together the secret court because they had found that Perkins 28, one of the rooms where the undergrads were living in, had a group of people that they wanted to investigate. And they were doing it because they thought that they were going to protect the next class, the incoming class, from this disease. So you can tell how misunderstood LGBTQ people were. And then the role of these courts in keeping the stigma and that misunderstanding in place. So the only way that we were going to undo that misunderstanding was for LGBTQ people to come out and say, hey, that's not how it works. This is, we know we are, this is who we are. This is something innate in us. But we couldn't do that because coming out was so self-destructive. And we saw it in how the court handled this. So the fact that we're waiting until now to finally speak openly about it, that it took, until 1950 for the Mattachine Society, the first long-lasting group of activists to come together, was all because groups like these existed to keep the stigma in place and to keep us from forming and bonding together and undoing this misunderstandings. So it's important, I think, today to realize that where we are is because of things like this that happen in our inner society and our history.
This history question is such an interesting one because I think there's some who would say that what happened in 1920, that would never happen at Harvard in 2020. And I've heard people who agree with that, and there's a sense of pride in how far we've come. We have a BGLTQ office now. We have some institutionalized supports for students, staff, and faculty that didn't exist even a decade ago. But at the same time, there's this question of, are there parts of this history that still manifest in some ways today? So I want to take a moment and read our former president, Larry Summers, submitted a statement to the Crimson at the time when this article was first published. I'll briefly share. These reports of events long ago are extremely disturbing. They are part of a past that we have rightly left behind. I want to express our deep regret for the way this situation was handled, as well as the anguish the students and their families must have experienced 8 decades ago. Whatever attitudes may have been prevalent then, persecuting individuals on the basis of sexual orientation is abhorrent and an affront to the values of our university. We're a better and more just community today because those attitudes have changed as much as they have. And so the question is, have these attitudes changed as much as they have? I'm asking this to all of you as current students here. What's your experience on campus today? And where would you locate the places where we have some room to grow? Alden, I would love to hear from you on this one.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to reflect on time, especially in a time when the fabric of time itself seems to be breaking down because we're all sort of staying inside all day. But I think the lived experience of queer students on campus is really complicated. And I think that sort of the attempt to strip people of their complexity, strip identities of their nuance, not allowing people to exist as they are, but putting them in boxes. is something that I think still happens today on campus. I think certain students have more support than others do. And I mean, I've spent a whole year at the BGLTQ Office of Student Life. I mean, I care very deeply about the queer community, but some queer students just aren't getting the support that they need, and they don't know, or they don't have access to institutional power, and they don't necessarily have the same kind of voice that other people do on campus. And I'm thinking about like something like housing, for example. Like when I came into Harvard, I got a call from the housing office because I'm a trans person, basically asking me like what I wanted to do about housing. And I think when we had our Visitas panel for admitted BGLTQ students, that was one of the biggest concerns that kept coming up for incoming students was housing and feeling safe in housing. And I personally had a situation happen during my sophomore year where the Title IX office got involved, and I actually had to move rooms because someone I was living with said something transphobic to me. And I feel really lucky because I am in a place that's very safe for me to be. I'm at home with my parents who love me and support me. And I'm very lucky to be able to say that because that's not true for everyone. But I really had to advocate for myself during that whole process of trying to figure out my housing situation. And I think if I didn't feel empowered as a queer student because of the access I had to something like the BGLTQ office, I never would have, I don't think I would have felt as safe. I don't think I would have felt like it was my place to do it. And I think like housing is one of a situation in which like often those real like sort of what we think of as theoretical institutions of homophobia, institutionalized racism actually can be manifest to the point where like I didn't feel safe necessarily going back to my room. And that's something that students deal with. And I think I think that letting queer students sort of giving them the space to talk about what they need rather than the top-down approach of administrators sort of telling us what we might need, not involving us in the process of housing, how important it might be for maybe students to be a part of how these policy decisions are made, because we're the ones who are actually living in these rooms. We know the situation. I think those are some of the thoughts that I have.
Let's continue on this strand for a moment. And I know, Natalie, earlier on, you shared that you're a peer counselor in one of the largest peer counseling groups on campus. I'm curious, as someone who's worked both in peer counseling and also the BGLTQ office, what would you say the support looks like now for LGBTQ students? And where would you say are some of the areas that Harvard can be growing from an undergraduate perspective? And we'll get to the graduate students in a moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the reality is that support looks really, really different for every member of our community. Like what everyone needs, what everyone wants and seeks out is really different. I think the important thing is ensuring that there is as wide a range of support systems as there are students, whether that is mental health through a very like formalized and visible service such as counseling and mental health services, whether that's through a peer counseling service where folks can just come in at night and talk out whatever's on their mind, or whether that's through creating networks of kind of social connections so that students are able to see that there are others who share their experiences on campus, regardless of level of outness, as well as level of kind of previous involvement in formalized kind of student groups or offices on campus, kind of allowing students to see that those things are there should they need them, I think is really important. And I think that in my eyes, definitely mental health is a big area where there's a lot of need for improvement. at CAMS, I think that there is constantly a shortage in general of counselors, but particularly of counselors who are affirming to students of a very wide array of marginalized identities. It is a well-recognized and documented problem that there are not enough counselors of color at CAMS. And I know many, many students who have had challenging experiences with counselors, including for many genderqueer students, not really finding at CAMS an affirming space with respect to pronouns or chosen names. And so I think even just like a base level of education on those topics is really important, really for all Harvard staff, but particularly I think in the realm of mental health, we've seen so clearly that BGLTQ students do struggle with mental health at much higher rates consistently than non-BGLTQ students at the college. And it is a very massive problem in my eyes that the resources are really just not there to support those students when and if they do reach out for help.
I do definitely want to get back to that question about mental health, specifically in this current unusual circumstance that we find ourselves in, because we know that LGBTQ students there's a significant proportion of our community who are going back home into environments that now, ironically, are less supportive than the university. Finding that they need to go back into the closet in order to feel safe, or in order to be able to manage this longer period of time at home than they were expecting. We'll definitely get back to that question. What does LGBTQ life look like in the COVID era? But I also want to hear from the graduate students. One of the interesting things about Harvard, this terrible phrase, every tub on its own bucket, and decentralization, these are things that we're so familiar with at this institution. But that also means that even here on campus, support for undergraduates versus graduate students looks very different. So I'm wondering, Kimm or Kamille or Diego, if you could share a little bit about what organizing looks like at the graduate level now.
Sure, I'm happy to chime in on this issue. I mean, as I mentioned in my introduction, I did graduate from Harvard College in 2010. So that was before the founding of the BGLTQ office. So I didn't have a Sheehan that I could turn to. I was also in the closet, which was another set of issues. And I'm so happy that queer undergrads are being better supported now than they were a decade ago. But the fact of the matter is, as we've heard, they're still not being supported enough. And Harvard lags its peers by decades on this issue. The most recent university climate survey found that queer students and students of color did not feel the same sort of belonging on campus that other groups did. And that shouldn't surprise us, given, as you were saying, Sheehan, how uneven LGBTQ support is across the university. So students at the college have the QAFIS, but with the exception of students at the medical school, graduate students do not have access to full-time LGBTQ program staff that they can turn to for support. And so what that means is that a majority of the labor that goes into providing LGBTQ programming for students has to be taken on by students themselves. And to me, that's just not right. I mean, when students have to expend, their energy into creating an environment that feels safe and welcoming for them in the first place, they necessarily have less energy to do what they came here to do, which is their research, which is to do their work. And we as a community have been told that there are not financial resources for the kinds of support that we're asking for, and that Harvard's decentralization makes resolving this issue really challenging. As a member of staff, I can appreciate this in one way, but that response is really frustrating and pretty eye-rolly, frankly, for a few reasons. But I think the biggest reason that's frustrating is that institutions always find resources for the things that they value. They find a way. And so if the university really wants to demonstrate its commitment to LGBTQ students, they have to stop hedging and start making real investments. So to me, this means committing resources to equitable student support across schools. It means providing more robust, reliable mental health support and services. It means providing visible physical gathering spaces that aren't, in basements. And it also requires making faculty hires that can initiate a greater and deeper study of LGBTQ topics.
And I guess I'll chime in too. When I first arrived to the Kennedy School, we received these name placards that we put in front of us to be called by name in class. But there's some teachers that still use Mr., Mrs., or whatnot. And also students refer to each other in conversation. And I thought that we were really needing pronouns to be visible so that we were able to change the norms about making assumptions about what pronouns use because of how they look. So I went to the school and I engaged in a semester-long fight to get at first I tried to get the placards reprinted. Eventually it came to this compromise to put stickers on the placards, which worked out well. But this is the kind of thing that students have to take on themselves to change the environment in the school to support LGBTQ people and students. So eventually got profiled in the New York Times because this is something that is coming. And when a school like Harvard does it, it gets picked up. Since then, I've gotten calls from so many other schools and other students trying to do a similar thing. So it's important for Harvard to also be a leader in this space like that as well. Sadly, it's coming from the students.
Diego, you touched on something that I think is really at the heart of the secret court, and that's visibility. What I love about what you were able to do there, and understanding that you took this on as a student who already had a full set of commitments, right, academic, but providing opportunities for the community to be visible in ways that we aren't at a glance, right? And I think, and when I look at the secret court and just that history, there's a kind of imposition of secrecy. These documents were put in a box. They were put in storage. They were locked up for 80 years. It took a lot to uncover any aspect of this story. But then if we're also thinking back to 1920 itself, secrecy is at the heart of the court proceedings, right? This was an ad hoc extrajudicial tribunal of 5 people that was created specifically to investigate homosexual activity, going outside of the normal ad board process. Right? So I'm wondering, I think I'm going to, Kamille and Diego, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts here, and anyone else who wants to chime in, please do. But what do you make of this secrecy, and what's the impact on those of us today who are living, learning, and working at an institution that values so much truth?
During last night's faculty panel, Professor Evelyn Hammonds said 2 things that really resonated with me. The first thing that she said was, homophobia is not an abstraction to me. And the second thing that she said was, our history is our history. We can't run away from it. And unlike, President Summers had hoped for in his statement, we can't leave it behind. Yet it does seem to be a pattern for institutions like Harvard to bury or ignore the ugly parts of their history. Now, slavery is, of course, the most abhorrent example of this, but something like the secret court is troubling as well. In the same way that we celebrate, 1636 as the founding year of our institution, we also have to openly acknowledge 1920 as a year of a profound moral failure that we must not repeat. And when institutions fail to make that history visible, they extend their first moral failing. They continue the harm. And Harvard and places like it have a responsibility, I think, to behave honestly, and with integrity and transparency. And I think what this whole case really shows is that it often falls to regular, university citizens to demand and even enact this transparency. Institutions, regardless of how free-thinking and liberal they claim to be, are inherently conservative. And now it's in their organizational DNA. That shouldn't discourage us, but we do have to keep that in mind as we're doing the work. And so, unfortunately, I do think that the work of making Harvard a more open and honest place, a place of fewer secrets and less suppression, is work that we as members of the community all have to share through protest and activism, and through conversations like the one we're having today.
And I think the point of visibility is really important, because if you look at the data from Pew about why people changed their minds, it was because people that they knew were coming out, and then they're talking to these people that they knew personally. Their thoughts and their hearts were changing as they got to know people, and also about visibility. When you saw Will and Grace and TV shows and Ellen coming out, it really changed the way that people thought of LGBTQ folks. So the secrecy of the court itself, actually there was one student that was kicked out just because he was talking about homosexuality with his friends. He wasn't accused of being involved in anything. He was just talking too much about it. And that talks about the fact that the ban on advocacy was so strict. We were banned to even try to explain ourselves. And I think that goes at the heart of the secret court, the harm done. I think about the erasure that has happened because of that too in all of history. I remember when I was an immigrant, a young immigrant in Miami, my parents had just moved from Colombia. They really latched onto the church for community. And I think when families move from someplace that they don't know well. So I grew up in a very evangelical space, and I was a very impressionable young person getting a lot of messages from my church. And at the same time, I was realizing I was gay. But when I started reading Martin Luther King's, for example, a letter from Birmingham jail about the little 6-year-old girl going to Funtown and having clouds of inferiority forming over her head when she realizes she can't go, I also kind of started to realize that I was going through something like that too, that going somewhere in the church saying that who I was wasn't okay, the messages I got from different politicians, that was giving me also this cloud of inferiority as well. Then later, after I came out and started getting really into LGBTQ history, I learned about Frank Kameny storming the American Psychiatric Association's meeting and asking to be taken off the mental illness handbook. Or Madeline Davis, who at 5 a.m. at the 1972 Democratic Convention said, "We are the untouchables of society and that needs to change." I feel like I got robbed of all of my heroes because of that secrecy, because of that erasure. If I had known about these heroes, if I was a teenager with all those homophobic ideas around me, but I knew about them in the history books, I could have found a refuge there. So I think that's somewhere that this secrecy, this erasure, all that is still a symptom of discrimination, and it's still something we have to fight.
And beyond that, I think learning that this secrecy and this cloudiness, it isn't just about the court and the court's existence. It happens everywhere, and the ways that I've found it and stumbled upon it in Harvard's history and in larger histories, it's by chance that I've been learning about this. I think on one end, we assume, for example, the male identification of these students, and we assume that they were gay students. There are a lot of assumptions that go into the way we even understand the history of the court now that seems to erase the whole spectrum of identities that we know are embedded in the BGLTQ community and in that experience. I think beyond that, something that didn't even come up yesterday that Kamille and I spoke about a little bit is the fact that Alain Locke was a Black gay man and the first Black Rhodes Scholar and the only one that came for the next 5 decades because they figured it out afterward. It had been a blind process at the time. That is someone who was at Harvard before the secret court. So we can imagine what that experience looked like, but we also can't to some extent. In my own experience, I'm graduating with a special concentration, meaning individualized study, basically in geography. It'll be the first degree in geography at Harvard in over 70 years. And in learning that history and trying to just articulate why I wanted to study this discipline, I learned that in the 1940s, a big part of the reason that Harvard disbanded this department was the known homosexuality of Derwent Whittlesey, who was the head faculty of the department at that time. So again and again, I keep finding myself stumbling upon these histories, and it just shows that secrecy continues to color the way that we understand our history and all that we don't know. I think those limitations are frustrating, but they also represent an opportunity in conversations and efforts like this one. And on the other end, I think there's this amazing response that can come of this, which is, I mean, I am a resident of Lowell House, and Lowell, Abbott Lawrence Lowell was the president of Harvard, overseeing all of this at an even higher level in 1920. But at the same time, when I entered the House, the faculty deans were Dorothy and Diana, who were the first queer faculty deans of a house at Harvard ever. They had a historic marriage. They have beautiful portraiture that hangs where President Lowell's once did. And so I think there is an opportunity among this secrecy to acknowledge and I guess to some extent accept the limitations on the way we will understand our history, but also this beautiful opportunity in the present to celebrate that we're here, to celebrate what we know, and to bring these stories to light. Because as Diego was saying, and as we've all talked about when speaking with each other, knowing these people exist and celebrating these histories makes it a lot easier and happier and better to be who we are and to come to terms with our own identities, as disparate as they are.
I think one thing that I would like to add to this conversation is I also think it's really important to ground our understanding of this secrecy in the present day utility of it in shaping campus culture. And I think for me, when I look at that question, I think it ultimately comes down to the reality that if Harvard isn't questioned, Harvard doesn't have to answer. And because of that, they really don't want to give us fodder to ask questions. Like, there is a reason that these histories are obfuscated in this way. There's a reason that when a young undergrad journalist discovered the secret courts, the administration changed the clearance level on that information so that he couldn't access it anymore. And I think we've seen this across so many incredible advocacy movements on campus, whether it's in the ongoing fight for ethnic studies or for a multicultural center or for workers' rights, that this represents a burden for change being placed on students. And the fact that everything that we have now, we have because we fought for it. And historical events like this make it really clear that Harvard wasn't built for us, and that if we want to make a future where students at the intersections of all sorts of marginalized identities are able to really feel meaningful ownership over Harvard, we have to build them from the ground up. And we have to ground our activism and our advocacy in full knowledge of the institutional and historical context in which we're working. So yeah, I guess just when Harvard asks us over and over what we need to feel like we belong and feel like Harvard is ours, they should just listen to what we've been saying for decades.
You all probably can't see this, but the panelists are each saying amen, preach. Natalie, what you've just shared, I think, is spot on. And I was trying to rush to jot down that statement, then I remembered that this is recorded, thankfully. But if Harvard isn't questioned, Harvard doesn't have to answer. And I really do want to hold on to that. I'm looking at the six of you and just thinking about how much wisdom there is in this panel, wisdom, advocacy. And I'm also balancing that with the informal ways, it sounds like, that we all came or stumbled upon, in Russell's words, this history, this information. You know, there's a way in which us being a part of this panel, there's a lot of coincidence behind that. You know, this isn't a part of Harvard's curriculum. This isn't something that any of us came here expecting really to be involved in. So I'm thinking about the transmission of history. And queer elders. I don't know if you've heard that phrase before, but there's a way, Natalie and Russell, that the two of you as paths in kind of sharing this history with your first year students. You're queer elders, very young queer elders, I think, maybe the youngest ever, but queer elders still. And so let's talk for a moment about that history, that transmission of information, and what it takes to make sure that this isn't just a May 22nd moment, but something that is more a part of the Harvard experience, that we all have to reckon with this history. And Kimm, I'm wondering if you can speak to this in particular because of your work at the Ed School and your interest in the teaching process. If you have anything to share here.
Yeah, and I'm just resonating so much with what everyone is sharing, and especially Natalie and Kamille, what you brought up about especially what happens in graduate programs, which is we're here for, in my case, a year. And so to push forward any policy or challenging of the institution is very tricky because we're kind of in and out of this rotating door. And so while I've been at the Ed School, I've been connecting with former students. So thinking about our elders or the people that came before us. And two students a couple of years ago did some research asking students about their knowledge of gender. And these are all educators that they were surveying. And 50% of the students that they surveyed said that they didn't have any formal education or experience while at the Ed School related to gender. And so for me, that's just really concerning that it isn't a part of the curriculum, because we know that gender shows up in classrooms every day in so many different ways. And so I think, as students, if we can build on the work that has come before us, and I've been collaborating with another Ed School student, Arushi Mittal, and we've, given a proposal to the Ed School to say, this is really what we hope to see so that future students can feel like they are really supported here in their work around gender. So I think, if we can continue to build on each other's work and stay connected beyond Harvard and reaching back to folks who have done work before us, that's really where the power can be built.
I'm also thinking about, I actually took Harvard and Slavery this semester. It was one of the most important classes I've taken at this school, I think, because most people don't understand just how connected Harvard's wealth right now is to the institution of slavery. The only way that you can have $38 billion in 2020 is if you were deeply invested in the most profitable thing in the, you have to have been involved in slavery. And I think the process of learning about it in the classroom, I found it very interesting, both because so many of the names around us are, so many of the places, the buildings that we go, I don't know, the history of Cambridge is so much actually the history of slavery. The history of slavery in New England, which is something that people don't really talk about. People don't think that slavery happened in the North, that it was just the South. But there were slaves on campus. And there's been, I know, a push, like Drew Faust put up the plaque on Wadsworth House, which is great, but it's also illegible unless you're 2 feet away from it. And maybe that's the Cambridge Historical Society. But I also think it's I think that Harvard and Slavery should be a general education course. I think that every student who comes on campus should have to learn this history. And I think as people who will have Harvard on our resume as a part of ourselves, to be able to be accountable, to be able to share that with other people, because I think in the things that I learned about Harvard's connection to slavery that I shared just with my peers, people have no idea. People truly have no clue. And I think making it so that there is some kind of document or report that students get when they enter the school. Like, this is the history of the institution, not the history of the institution that the institution is writing, but the one that people who are actually living and on campus, the one that we know, the one that we have had to literally fight for, because Harvard is trying to keep things so hidden. And so I think bringing these issues into the classroom, making it mandatory for all Harvard students to at least know what the secret court is, that everyone can answer the question, what happened and what it means and how things have changed, I think is really, really important.
I think going off that as well, it feels so important as well to kind of what I was talking about last time, like ongoing advocacy efforts to be aware of the lineages and be aware of the connections and be able to draw on that collective wisdom rather than starting from scratch every time. Just yesterday at the panel, I was so interested to hear about some of the Crimson's publishing when like this information first came out, and specifically to hear about one op-ed that was published that basically said the secret courts did the right thing. I don't get why this is like a big deal. We should all stop talking about it. Homosexuality is bad. And I was reminded of an effort last year, my sophomore year, of myself and a few other interns at the Office of BGLTQ Student Life to respond to an op-ed that, like, looking at them side by side, it was eerie. They were saying the same thing. They were saying like queer sexuality and queer sexual behavior is inherently perverted. And in my case, it was pushing against Sex Week. And just like being able to see those similarities and kind of draw on the collective knowledge of how to respond there, I think is a really invaluable thing. And so having, just like Alden was saying, a collective and longstanding history that isn't written by the institution, but that is written by the people who have been doing this work before us, is something that would just be so powerful.
We have a question from an alum, and I want to Kamille, I'm going to direct this question to you, and I think you'll know why. But the question is, how important is it for current students to connect with alumni who may have had a different experience? So even when I was at the college in 1980, there was not an openness to being out. Several of my classmates from that time are now active in advocating for BGLTQ rights. Is there a way for them to be resources for current students? And Kamille, I'm asking you that question as a former president of the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus, which is the BGLTQ alumni organization at Harvard.
I so appreciate this question. And, you know, I was not out when I was in college, as I mentioned before, and the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus, this alumni community, that was my first queer community, and it has been so meaningful to me, and it continues to have resonance in my life today. I have a very close friend and mentor in Robin Oakes, who I know is on the call today, who I don't know that I would have gotten connected with were it not for the Gender and Sexuality Caucus. And so I think, you know, if I had had a Robin Oakes when I was in college, I probably wouldn't have been as depressed. I probably would have done better academically because I would have had a queer elder to talk to who understood, you know, what it was like to be a bi woman at Harvard. And so it's vital. It's absolutely vital for current students to connect with alumni who've had different experiences and with community members who have had different experiences. And so I encourage like current students to please get in touch with the Gender and Sexuality Caucus. There's an event every year, which is happening virtually this year due to our current pandemic. But you know, there's a commencement dinner. We try to show up at Lavender graduation every year for the undergrads. And we really want to be a resource as alumni to current students. And I mean, not just about, you know, our sexual identity, but also, you know, being a person in the world. I mean, other alumni groups, you know, are interested in like real estate or whatever. Like, why wouldn't you want to have an elder who shares some of your personal background to discuss business with, or politics and things of the day?
And I can say to that too, the Gender and Sexuality Caucus is such a great supporter of the BGLTQ office. I know in the past we've had alumni years. So the class of 1983, for example, has sponsored several scholarships to graduating seniors. And this year, the Gender and Sexuality Caucus has sponsored an award for a graduating senior who has had a profound BGLTQ leadership on campus. And so I think those are just two small ways of many, many, many ways that were supported by the alumni community on campus. And I should also say too, that when students were, when the campus de-densified and students were required to leave at the beginning of the COVID crisis, that I received so many responses from the alumni community asking, how can we help? Because of course, these are people who immediately understood what was at stake for our BGLTQ students and being required to go home, many of them to environments that would not be supportive as the campus community.
One thing too, as VP of Diversity at KSSG, I noticed that this was a big problem, especially for graduate students, that we leave so fast, but we start things that take a lot more time to get done. And then the wheel gets reinvented every time, and it's a problem. So I just last week passed an alumni diversity advisory board in the KSSG. And we're filling it in with recent graduates that were between 1 and 3 years removed, and graduates 3+ years removed, to give the people that have been involved in this work an opportunity to advise everybody currently doing it, to train them and to keep this work going as long as the work needs to go. You know, it usually takes a lot more than 2 years. So I got a little trouble of it for pushing for it, but I think it's totally worth it. And I think that's one way that we can solve this problem of keeping alumni in the loop for pushing for change.
We have another question. In light of the fact that Harvard does lag behind other universities and support for BGLTQ students, I wonder what have been the journeys of BGLTQ student groups at other universities and who have been their allies in this process among staff, student, faculty, and external policymakers. I'll give a brief response to that. And then I'm wondering if some of our undergraduate students or any of the campus BGLTQ student organization leaders might be able to speak to this too, who your allies have been here at Harvard. But I do know that there are some institutions that we look to as expert in this area. I know that a few of the other Ivy League schools have BGLTQ centers, full buildings that support the entire campus community going back decades, as many as 30 years in some cases. And what I've learned from communicating with those, my counterparts in those offices is that really a lot of the challenges that we experience here because of decentralization, they don't manifest at these schools. They deal with different problems. But when it comes to identifying who it is on point, who is meant to ensure that staff are well educated, administrators are able to respond skillfully and compassionately around gender and sexuality, there's an office for that. You know, where are the places where undergrads can interact with BGLTQ elders, whether those are alums or staff or faculty or graduate students? There are centers for that, natural gathering spaces on campus. And the one consistent thing that I, at least in my experience, have seen is that those gathering spaces that are multi-generational are so critical to a healthy BGLTQ student life, beyond student life, a healthy university life. So I'll just say that for now. And I'm wondering if the student leaders, any of you who have run BGLTQ student orgs might be able to speak to this.
I personally have not, but I wanted to bring in the point, which is that we've begun organizing. We started last in the fall, and we had our first meeting, and there were probably 15 people in the room, and that included faculty, it included students, graduate and undergraduate, and it included staff. And sitting around the room, it was, you know, it was the biggest meeting like this I had been in. But what I was surprised to hear was that from faculty who had been here for 10, 20 years, that this was the first time that a conversation like this was happening, and that all these people who know each other and have worked together at various times were getting in the room. And I believe 8 years was the number we were hearing. When I look at my own experience, the mentors and elders that I've run into have been by chance, and I've been really lucky to find them. But my dean freshman year, my first year, was Dean Waddell, who actually that was a random chance. And she is a queer Black woman. And she saw actually my application as she's reading through and sorting roommates together, and placed me with a student from a background where he could not be openly homosexual before, but was actually able to kind of sort that out at Harvard. And her putting the two of us together completely changed both of our experiences on campus and gave us our own little sort of queer experience to begin. And we had community form even just in our dorm outward. But that was lucky, and it was somewhat random, and I'm lucky that Dean Waddell was there, but that's how I got that. And I mean, I was the peer advising fellow in Thayer for the next year, and Alden was one of my advisees. So, you know, these things seem to happen. I'd like to think that there are people in there who are pushing for this, but I think even getting into their hands in the first place is luck. And I think I've been really shocked to hear how rare it is for us to come together. Something that Natalie, Alden, and I have talked about is how little there has been in our time as undergrads in the Queer Students Association or anything like it. I have often found myself wondering where to even begin and don't know where to go. I've been lucky in my own life and in my own friendships, but like I said, it's chance and it's effort, and there's no easy way to do it, is what I've realized. And the externalities of that, they go beyond just feeling isolated. I think they actually really present harms to the community. I think that issues like harassment and assault really happen at higher rates when we don't have communities to gather and get to know one another. I think there are enormous problems that happen within these spaces and amongst one another when we aren't given chances to know each other in safe and welcoming spaces, to seek each other out, to find mentors. And I think that applies among our peers and also with elders. It's a known problem in queer spaces that there are terrible issues with power dynamics, and that a lot of times the vulnerability of young queer students and young closeted students really puts them in serious danger and puts them in positions where not only do they not have mentorship, but when they seek it out or try to find it, it's to their harm. And so I think it goes far beyond the frustration of not having a space to hang out or get to know one another, which I think is often how these things become dismissed. It's a real safety issue, and it's a real threat that I think just really boils up beyond basic conversations of, do we get an office? Do we get a space? Where does it go? And Harvard has made no effort, as it's had capital campaigns and as it's built out spaces. You know, we got a student center with fast food in it and big glass buildings and lots of nice offices, but we still don't have anything above ground for us. There's nowhere to gather. This is not unique to queer students. We don't have a multicultural center. And just Harvard continuing to lag behind, to fail in its role as a leader in our country and in our educational system, it's harmful, and it hurts us, and it's actually it's dangerous.
Russell, I think you said that perfectly. Thank you so much for articulating so much about why this really is not just a matter of quote unquote community building or socializing, but that the stakes are so much more greater than that. We do have a few questions from listeners. So I will, Jonathan, if you want to ask your question.
Sure, can you guys hear me?
We sure can.
Perfect, thank you. This is a great event. I wanted to share very briefly my experience with homophobia historically at Harvard and the positive result that came from that. I was class of '82, graduating January '83 at the college, class of '90 at the law school. Derek Bach, the president of the university, refused to adopt a university-wide non-discrimination policy. My housemaster at Leverett was hostile when I was harassed at night in my dorm, in my room. And the university had absolutely no response at all when the, let me make that go away. When the Crimson reported that my boyfriend and I had been attacked on the downtown Boston Park Street subway station for holding hands. It was front page news in the Crimson. We got 0 calls from anyone in the administration. But one of the things I became aware of when Bach said, look, one reason we don't have a non-discrimination policy covering sexual orientation is we don't have to. It's not legally required. And I realized that Cambridge was the only liberal enclave in the country that not only didn't have a gay rights law, but didn't have a local civil rights law at all. I ended up staying in Cambridge when I graduated and decided to change that, started a gay political group focused on the local elections, and created the climate for an ordinance and was asked to write one and did, lobbied and got it passed. And the reason that Cambridge has a non-discrimination ordinance now is very much traceable to Derek Bach's hostility towards one. And I made sure that the ordinance covered Harvard in every one of its functions, as an educator, as a landlord, as an employer, and so forth. And it's a bit of history that's sort of, buried now. It is what led me to go to law school. And I applied only to Harvard and was openly gay about in the application and told them it was the only place I was applying for law school and got in. So it was a great result from a very homophobic environment. And it was a result that when Harvard then did adopt a policy, in part because of the ordinance, made it to their advantage to do so. That, as several of the commentators have mentioned, Harvard is a thought leader, and that led other universities to do the same. So I'm curious, again, it sort of follows up on the earlier questions of, how to the extent that this is useful history for people active now, how to share that and how to be more in touch with current student leaders.
I would welcome anyone who wants to respond to that question. I will say, Jonathan, thank you so much. And as I look through the list of participants, I see so many people here as part of this conversation who we have to thank. I know Kamille mentioned Robin Oakes earlier in this conversation, but we wouldn't have a BGLTQ office. At the very least, we wouldn't have so much of the non-discrimination policies that we have and the generalized support that exists, whether outside of the university or within, without the work of people like you and others who are on this call. So thank you all, sincerely.
And listening and realizing that there's so many alumni on here, I just want to bring attention to the fact that this is a real clear moment of moral clarity. Hearing your stories and understanding what happened to you, and then understanding what our lived experience is now, and then thinking about 1920s in the secret court. This is a moment for all of us to realize that there is still a lot more to do. And we, as LGBTQ people, have the ethical claim to full and equal rights as everybody else. We cannot forget that. And the alumni that are here, I encourage you to get in touch with your student government and alumni councils. There is the avenues to create these advisory groups that I think we need more of. We just passed the first one at the student government at the Kennedy School, but I think we can do maybe at the law school and such, or maybe through Lambda or some of the other organizations. And I think that this is a good reminder of, one, the work that I want to hear more from the work that the alumni have done in this space, to learn from them and to follow in their footsteps, and two, to bring them to the fold, because alumni support goes a long way for student activism. So welcome all that help, please.
And just jumping in on that, I think this is a good opportunity to begin to frame, and we'll get back more into it at the end, but where this panel sits within a larger effort. There's a lot we want to do, and this is a great opportunity 100 years later to start bringing us all together, just like we are in this room, just like we were yesterday. We're coming together and we're all asking what we can do. And what we want a lot of stuff, and we want to hear from you, and we want anyone who's here right now. And if you have friends who aren't here right now and you think that they might have something to say or contribute, we want to do all of that. We were in the process of planning the first ever Queer Arts Festival at Harvard, which is now a big headache because we aren't on campus, but we're working through that. We were going to have, and will at some point have, dramatic reading of Unnatural Acts, the play that is based on the Secret Court of 1920 at the ART on campus. Kamille is working toward having a podcast that will be related to this event, but we all see it already as a great opportunity to start telling the queer history of Harvard. And just from that one comment, it's so clear that this is gonna come out of the woodworks. And so much of what we've talked about is secrecy and legacy and figuring out how to even position ourselves now. And I think equally important to gathering as current students and engaged alumni is also finding ourselves in this history and seeing how work like that has been done and knowing that it's come from our community. Every time we have these conversations, I'm doubly inspired to do more. And I keep hearing that from anyone who hears about this. So just know that there's a lot more to do. There's a lot more that we are doing. We want to hear from you. And you have a place in this effort. It's a big part of the idea of today and of yesterday is to get things going. This is by no means our event, this is really a starting point. And just because you're not on the screen right now, that has very little to do with it. We really just want to get going. So see yourself as part of this and please stay involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point about the podcast, if I may make a little plug, Jonathan, I hope that you won't mind if I get in touch with you to talk to you about your story, because I do think the podcast is going to need to be, a story about Harvard's queer history, as much of it as we have. So if you have made it to the call today, you have my email address. And if there's a story that you'd like to share, please be in touch. We would love to talk to you and hear from you.
It's wonderful. And I know that we will be sharing a link also for those of you who want to stay in touch about these ongoing efforts. We'll share that link in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback about this event, as well as the ideas that you might have for how you want to plug into these efforts moving forward. Again, this is an inaugural event, the beginning of what we hope will be a much larger effort to make sure that that this is not just a centennial, but something that's much more integrated into what we understand and how we understand ourselves in relation to Harvard. We do have another question from Meredith. And Meredith, please feel free to ask your question.
Mute myself, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, my name is Meredith Toulousan. I am a trans alumna. When you talk about secret courts that are in the past, I can't help but think about, what is happening now and ask what is happening now in terms of how cases of trans and queer-related harassment are adjudicated at Harvard, if anybody has information about that. Just because I work as an investigative journalist and over the years have heard reports from various colleges that that in situations where mostly trans people experience harassment or discrimination, the investigation and adjudication processes in those situations can be extremely non-transparent. And I realize that I actually am not aware of the situation in my own alma mater. And so I wanted to inquire if anybody has thoughts or information.
I would welcome anyone to jump in here. Meredith, I want to make sure I understood your question really about, not a question about how issues of discrimination today are adjudicated on campus and how those are brought to light.
So, so in a number of concrete situations, for instance, there are a number of, I went to Cornell for grad school, and their harassment adjudication process involves a panel convening not in the presence of the student who has complained about harassment or discrimination, and that discussions are closed to the student. That's an example of sort of like administrative bodies convening in a non-transparent manner. And I was wondering if people are aware of how Harvard adjudicates harassment situations, and if people are not aware, we should probably find out. and I am probably, when I come out of this call, would probably make inquiries if people aren't aware of what the situation is at Harvard.
Thank you so much for repeating that. I can answer your question, and I will say that it is a little bit complicated in this particular moment because some of what you've shared does fall under Title IX here at Harvard. I know in my role as Director of BGLTQ Student Life, the staff in the BGLTQ office are trained as confidential resources. And so this means that when students reach out to us and want to disclose an incident of harassment or discrimination related to gender or sexuality, that we really work closely with those students at the advisement of our colleagues in Title IX, but that the student is always in the driver's seat and they are not in any way required to go through a Title IX process. Really, they're allowed to determine how and what ways they might like to resolve those issues. The university, I know the college takes those very seriously. And the reason I say that this is complicated is because Title IX, as many of you probably do know, the guidance has been revised. And so we're at this moment now where we're trying to identify what those changes will mean for the student experience, specifically related to reporting these incidents. But thankfully at Harvard, we also have a gender and sexuality non-discrimination policy. And so, while the federal government, there are certain requirements and that's its own process, Harvard has established its own non-discrimination policies, many of which are around today because of the advocacy of some of the folk on this call. And so I know that that's not specifically answering your question, and part of that challenge is that the issues that do fall under Title IX are in the process of being revised. And I wonder if we might have any colleagues from the Title IX office on the call. If you would like to jump in here, please feel free to raise your hand. I wonder if any of the students have a response there. Kim, please jump in.
Well, I actually have a response kind of not related to Harvard, because just hearing, people's stories and folks that I've spoken with who feel like what they've experienced is not adequately addressed by Harvard, I really do hope there's a sharing of resources within the local community, which I think are hard to find when you're new to the Cambridge community. So for example, the Network La Red is an organization that works with LGBTQ plus survivors of partner abuse. They have a confidential hotline that's open to folks, and there are many other resources just here in Cambridge and Boston that I think can be helpful supports for students, especially if they feel like there isn't someone on campus that represents their identities or is adequately supporting them. There are those other outlets as well.
Thanks, Kim. And in a moment, we will share a slide. We have some of those major resources that we can share. And I think this might be the right time to put that up on the screen. There were a small group of folk at the university worked together last year to create a LGBTQ plus resources page that's posted on the Title IX website. And so you'll see that link there at the top of this slide, as well as other resources that are mostly local to Boston. and primarily social in nature, but we also do want to emphasize that we have resources like access to the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, and Fenway Health in Boston as well. And I think there might be a few panelists who want to speak to that in a moment, but.
And I think all of that to say too, that we still want to hold Harvard accountable and continue to improve the policies, but just that there are, you know, many other resources that folks can access to.
I would encourage anybody who feels that this happens to them to reach out to their fellow LGBTQ students as well that are leaders and make a big fuss about it, because this is the way that we get things done and get things changed. I know it requires courage, and sadly this work has required a lot of courage from people taking that step, but I do think that the fact that there was so much silence about this lets me know that this might still be something that we need to address. So I'd just like to open the doors to communication in that front as well.
So on that note, maybe this is the right time. We have one more question that we definitely want to get to. And this is really a question about where do we go from here? So I think a lot of things, we've had many things come up in the conversation that we've named as potential avenues for future advocacy. But going around to each of you, thinking about future Harvard students, we're 100 years removed from the secret court, but what about 10 years from now, 100 years from now, or even here on campus in this moment, we've named some real challenges. Where would you say the advocacy is most needed? Where do we go from here? And Russell, I'm wondering if we can start with you, since again, you have been one of the masterminds behind pulling this commemoration, this reckoning together.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say that there are so many places where this work is happening, and I think I stumbled upon, to keep using that phrase, a really interesting place to jump into it. But a lot of the real work behind this and these resources is happening by random individuals. I mean, I think having Natalie versus someone else in charge of such an important mental health resource on campus makes a world of difference. Having us across the board, wherever we end up as queer people, it happens to make a difference. But there's a big need for actually institutionalizing these things and taking the burden off of students and taking the burden off of the very small handful of staff and faculty who happen to be here, very rarely in appointed positions where they're actually being paid to do the work of being a support resource for queer students. We're all wondering where that is and where the just basic financial output into this is. We don't have it, we haven't had it, we've never had it, and we need a lot more of it. So that's step one. On the other end of that, though, I think that something that was so powerful about hearing this history beyond the darkness of what really happened is the fact that leading up to that, these people chose to gather despite the risk, and that this room at Harvard became a place of queer life and queer community. And it's this really powerful thing to know that we always gather and we find ways to gather. And in a big way, I think that our community is our legacy, and that's sort of undying in a certain sense. And so I think on our end, figuring out how to keep gathering and coming together and having conversations like this, having strength in numbers and making these demands. I mean, there's a real breadth of experience within the BGLTQ community, and that's among undergraduates and graduates, different letters in that alphabet soup of identities. It's huge, and it really means different things to different people. And I cannot be in a conversation like this without acknowledging that my cis and white identities have made Harvard an easier place for me than for most of my queer classmates and friends. And I think that we need to have our strength in numbers, keep coming together, make this be the point at which we never forget our community again and our power as a community, and really start coming together and making the great number of symbolic and literal and real and adventurous demands that we want to make and that keep coming up. And I think that everyone has a lot of big things that are going to come up right now, and they're going to require all of us to make them happen.
And I really think that Russell's right, that we should capitalize on the momentum of this moment, of this panel. I mean, we had hundreds and hundreds of people, quite literally hundreds of people, express interest in this panel as well as the event last night. And that's so powerful. And I think what we need to do next is generate a list of asks and engage the administration in conversation. I know that we have some administrators here with us today, which is great to see. That's a really encouraging sign that Harvard's leadership is listening and that they do want to work with us. So I think where we come in, where, you know, the work that we have to do is to show up and be really clear about what the needs are, which I think we are quite clear about those, and be unified in our vision for what a better future really is.
Yeah, and I think it reminds me of the work that we have still to do. At the Kennedy School, for example, we fought to have the self-identifying question as LGBTQ in the application so we could have some data. I mean, the erasure of LGBTQ people still exists in the census and in so many places that are critical for funding resources. And Harvard should be a leader in having data for LGBTQ people and championing that in the country. And, you know, I think we really need to come together and think about what is the most ideal way that this community would be supported by Harvard, and not be afraid to push for that, and not be afraid to have Harvard live up to those ideals and Harvard live up to that vision, and because we deserve it. There's nothing that that says that we don't. You know, it's something that we need, and it's something that actually we're owed to because of the history. So I really do think that this is a moment to start organizing stronger than ever, and thinking of ways of what is the best, most ideal way that this school can support our community.
I think going off of Kamille's comments about kind of a concrete list of asks, I know I mentioned this before and it will very much not come as a surprise to anyone, but I think among all of these issues of housing, among others that have come up, what feels so incredibly urgent to me is the lack of mental health support at the college, and the need to improve and expand and diversify our counseling and mental health services in order to just really make it accessible meaningfully to all students, as well as just rethinking the systems of, as Russell mentioned, compensation for people who fill in the gaps at the college, considering compensating the labor, the many hours of labor by many individuals, filling in those cracks, as well as also rethinking the centrality of policing to systems of mental health care at the college is incredibly important when it comes to, as I said, making these systems accessible to folks who are subject to significantly more violence at the hands of police, both queer students, but particularly Black and Indigenous people of color as well. And yeah, I think we see this in secret courts. We see the role that mental health played and the role that the administration's negligence and real violence there had in ultimately ending the lives of several of the students involved. And I think that just as some of the negligence that we see today is a legacy of that, it continues to effectively drain the life out of many members of our community. So for me, that is always going to stick out as an incredibly urgent ask.
I think for me, we do this thing freshman year called first year called community conversations, where we like sit down, and I think I had to read, I don't even remember what I had to read, but I think instead of being forced to read a book, we could maybe like talk about this or talk about Harvard and slavery for like an hour. Like every single first year student has to engage substantively with this history. and have a conversation about it and talk about what it means and talk about how institutionally Harvard has made it very clear who it values and who it does not value, and leaving space for people wherever they are coming in to start to really engage with how complicated all of our relationships are to this institution, which is powerful in so many ways and for so many reasons. So I think really trying to bring this conversation into the classroom in all of the various, like your first week, you have like hours and hours of entryway meetings, just finding some time in there to really talk about what it means to be a Harvard student. Like, what legacy are you inheriting, and what can you do to make sure that you leave the institution better than you found it?
Completely agree. I'm here for a list of demands, and I think I would just reiterate updates to the curriculum across all of the schools, including all of the histories of exclusion that have existed at Harvard and what that means for students today. And also just to look at all of the policies, again, across the schools of trans inclusion, whether that's housing or mental health support, bathrooms, really anything that applies for trans students, making sure that we're really being intentional about that. And then finally, a faculty hire across the schools to see more LGBTQ representation, especially queer people of color, because again, students really need to see themselves in order to feel fully supported on campus.
In between all of this, I just wanted to highlight, we are going to be putting these asks together and we are going to be circulating information out. There will be petitions, there will be opportunities to get involved, and we have your emails, we'll be sending out forms. Please give us, try to respond to those, get on those, and we'll keep on using these channels, expand them outwards, share what you learn. These will be online. I wanted to highlight just a few of the things that came up to kind of, I mean, when you hear them in a list, I honestly think it helps, and that's what's been coming up today. But we want hires, we want resources, we want representation, not only in those places, but also on every decision-making body that has to do with equity and inclusion. We are part of that. We want curriculum changes. We want physical space. And also we want posthumous degrees. And I think that that's something that we haven't talked about today, but it was the immediate response when this news broke almost 20 years ago, was that we need recognition and we need posthumous degrees. That was shot down by the administration at the time on a technicality that these students had not finished their coursework, so they could not receive posthumous degrees. Then a quick response to that was that that has not been true, and that actually many deceased veterans who passed away before finishing their degrees did receive posthumous degrees. So it's very clear that that was swept under the rug, and the fact of the temporality of our experiences here as students allows the university to get away with that. But you can find the petition online from at least 10 years ago with about a bajillion signatures asking for that. And it's easy to keep waiting, but the year is 2020 and it's been 100 years and it's a significant time. And it's a strange time because we aren't on campus, but that recognition it's step one. It really is. And I think there's so much that comes out of this, but this is a really, really important history. And I think that stopping short at conversations like this, or stopping short at a statement from the president at the time, which we all know wasn't enough, or stopping short at plaques you can hardly read, it's not enough. And I think that really hearing this and letting this be known and, you know, making it such that we all actually know this and that it's not just something we find in the Crimson or from a friend of a friend or whatever. We need to know this to be able to mobilize. And I think it is Harvard's responsibility to do that. And I think that posthumous degrees are the way to begin that process and acknowledge what was done to these students.
I want to thank the 6 of you for participating in today's panel. I think I speak for everyone in saying that you're a tremendously powerful group of human beings, and we have learned so much in this hour and a half. Thank you for your advocacy, your leadership, and your frankness today. You've said things that we all needed to hear, and that I'm glad many people will continue to be able to hear, again, because this is a recorded conversation. Thank you as well to everyone who participated on the call. this was something, as many opportunities as we have to bring more folks into this conversation, the better, so that it isn't just an ad hoc, again, accidental stumbling into the truth, but rather a part of who we are as a university community. And so I want to end by reading the names of the students who were expelled or banned from Harvard in 1920. Donald Clark, Eugene R. Cummings, Kenneth Day, Stanley Gilkey, Joseph Lombard, Ernest Weeks Roberts, Harold Saxton, Edward Say, Keith Smirridge, Nathaniel Wolf. Thank you so much, everyone, and take good care.